Buying all of your Bitcoin at the absolute cycle lows is pretty much impossible to do. Yet many investors seem to think that they're able to sell all of their Bitcoin at the absolute cycle peak quite easily. Here we're going to cover the most effective methods of scaling out of your BTC positions very easily and to maximize your profits. Today, we're going to be looking at the best ways to take profit during a Bitcoin bull cycle, and where better to start than the Pi cycle top indicator chart we have here on bitcoinmagazinepro.com. So the Pi cycle top indicator chart throughout all of Bitcoin cycles has historically marked the Bitcoin cycle peaks timing within just 3 days. One of the best metrics at trying to take maximum profit at the highest price for your positions. But ultimately, we need to acknowledge that there is a possibility that this metric does not give us a signal this cycle. And if it does, it may not be within just a couple of days or on the exact date of the Bitcoin cycle peak. So we really need to get a strategy in place to make sure we are most effectively taking profit on our positions, to make sure we're not back holding all the way through the bear cycle or selling everything way before the cycle peak. So one way to do this is actually to turn the Pi cycle top indicator into the Pi cycle top and bottom indicator, or as I like to call it, the Pi cycle oscillator, because we now have this very nice data point that we can look at that gives us very clear and obvious buy and sell zones for Bitcoin based on the Pi cycle indicator. But what we can also do is almost see this as a percentage of the way through the cycle. So if we look to where we are right now, 50% of the way through the cycle. Obviously, this fluctuates every day. It may decrease, it may increase. This is just a very rough guide. But one thing we can do is look to when we're about to see a Pi cycle top indicator cross. So potentially when we see this oscillator at 95, so just before these indicators, these moving averages cross on that indicator to give us this sell signal. Because one thing we also need to acknowledge is due to the historic success and accuracy of the Pi cycle top indicator, if many people can actually see that these moving averages are converging and we're only a few days away from the cross, people are already going to start taking profit on their positions to the point where at the time when they do cross, we may be 10-20% lower than the all-time high. So one thing we can do is look to this metric, look to this oscillator. So if I just look at the previous 2 cycles, when this actually reached a value of 0.95 in 2017, for example, we could see that price was about $9,000 or $10,000. So what we could do is maybe every day after that hits 0.95, start taking out 2, 3, 4, 5% profit on your positions, because only 3 weeks later the price was at $20,000, but then only a couple days after that price again had dipped to about $10,000, and then a couple weeks later again we were hitting prices as low as $6,000. And in the 2020-2021 cycle, again we could see when this was at about 0.95, price was at about $55,000. And then as price rallied up to its all-time high at that point above $60,000, which was only a few weeks later, and then very quickly price dripped down to probably about $30,000. So one thing we need to do is make sure we're not holding everything and trying to sell everything at once. We need to try and scale out of our positions a bit nicer. It's rare that people will just put 100% of their capital into Bitcoin to buy everything. So it's odd that people have either a fixed price in their head of I'm going to sell everything at $150,000, $200,000, etc. We need to look at the data and just make very unemotional, unbiased, strategic decisions to scale out of the positions. So one other metric I like to use is the 200 weekly moving average heat map. And if we just go here, we can actually see the percentage increase of the 200 weekly moving average based on the Bitcoin price action. So when we have these very red warm colors over here, it indicates that this moving average is actually increasing by a value of about 10% every month. So this gives us almost a good amount of profit we should be taking. So for example, if we had a Bitcoin take profit signal now, for example, when we just have these pretty cold bluey colors, probably only about 2, 3, 4% of our position we should be selling. Whereas up here, when it's very vibrant, bright red, we should be taking 10% plus profit on our positions. And especially if used alongside some shorter term metrics like the active address sentiment indicator. So this is one of my favorite ones, which is looking at the 28-day percentage price increase of Bitcoin and the 28-day percentage increase or decrease in the active users on the Bitcoin network. So it almost gives us an insight into whether a move is sustainable because of lots of people coming in and using the network and we're seeing a price increase, then that kind of makes sense. But if we're not seeing a huge amount of people use the Bitcoin network and we're seeing the price increase rapidly, probably beyond what is maybe natural, then that gives us a little bit of an indication that we're maybe a little bit overheated. So if we just zoom in here, we have these deviation bands on this metric, this upper red deviation and this lower green deviation. So I like to look at this 28-day price change, which is this orange line crossing back above these deviation bands. So if we cross back above, then this gives us a very nice buy signal, indicates that maybe we were a little bit too extended to the downside. People got a little bit irrationally fearful. So when we cross back above, indicates more normal price action conditions. So like we saw recently here when price was about $60,000 and we've now rallied quite a bit higher than that. And similar for the sell signals. Once we see this cross rapidly above, we don't just want to immediately sell because the market can be very irrational and increase significantly more than we may think is reasonable. So we need to wait for this to come down a little bit and cross back beneath this upper red deviation band. So for example, after we set the all-time high at about $73,000, at about $68,000. So of course not perfect, but less than 10% decline from that point, we'd have got this sell signal to maybe start scaling out of our positions. And this has been true throughout all of Bitcoin's cycles. And another one I like to look at is the Bitcoin Crosby ratio, which is looking at the slope of the 30-period moving averages, or the arctangent. So what we can do here is just look, again, similar to what we see with potentially the 200 weekly moving average, looking at the percentage increase or decrease on that metric. It's just turning that theory into an oscillator for a much shorter duration. So we get these much more frequent signals. And again, we can see once we're into this upper red area, indicates that the market has moved up quite exponentially in a very short period of time, which maybe indicates that a little bit of at least a temporary pullback is required. And once we dip into this lower region down here, it gives us these pretty good buy opportunities, especially during a bull cycle to reaccumulate, and especially if we look for confluence with something like the golden ratio multiplier. So once we see these signals to sell as we're at a resistance point, which is defined by one of these moving averages, then that again gives us a very clear indication that the market may struggle to continue rallying much higher. This golden ratio multiplier is looking at the 350-day moving average, so nearly a year, and then multiplying that by the Fibonacci value. So if we just scroll down here, we can see the Fibonacci sequence defined as 0, 1, 1, 2, 3, 5, etc., and including the golden ratio multiple of 1.6. We can then multiply that 350-day moving average to get very accurate levels of variable support and resistance for the Bitcoin price action. And we just move over to TradingView here. We can actually collate all of these. If you have a Bitcoin Magazine Pro site subscription, you can use a lot of these metrics to actually refine them, use them on different time frames potentially. So if we just load up the Crosby ratio here, again, we can see the very clear and obvious buy and sell signals alongside the active address sentiment indicator. And if we look at something like the Pi cycle top indicator, I've just moved the green 350-day moving average multiplied by 2. So we're just looking at the 111-day moving average here, which really clearly defines Bitcoin bull cycles and bear cycles. So we can see very clearly we want to be looking to take profit when Bitcoin's price is rallying high. We don't want to be taking profit unless you've maybe held onto your stack a little bit too long during a bear cycle, because at that point the opportunity cost just doesn't make sense. You may as well hold on through to the next bull cycle. But if we just remove that and assume we know where and when we're in a bull cycle, and then look to the golden ratio multiplier again, if we just look to the previous cycle, we can see when we get confluence from multiple signals, when we see the Crosby ratio in this upper region at new all-time highs, coinciding with an active address sentiment indicator sell signal, as we're at resistance from the golden ratio multiplier, that's 3 signals all converging to give us the same signal, which really reiterates the strength of that signal and really kind of informs you that this is a signal that you really should be paying attention to. If we look to the previous 2017 all-time high, we could see we had multiple sell signals in the Crosby ratio, but not necessarily while we were at a resistance level, and not necessarily while we saw the active address sentiment indicator moving to potentially give us a sell signal. So at this point, maybe just scale out a smaller portion. But once you see this Crosby ratio and the overheated dipping back out of this upper red region, as we're at resistance, as the active address sentiment indicator is also giving sell signal, All of these are just screaming to start taking some profit. So of course, there's no perfect way to do this. You're always going to maybe start scaling out a little bit too early or a little bit too late. But this is infinitely more successful than just trying to sell everything at one point. Of course, there is the potential at the pi cycle top, the MVRVZ, lots of our other metrics that are great at predicting cycle tops may give us that signal and may be at the exact top once again. But you have to think, would you rather wait for a signal that maybe never comes or scale out just a few percentage points lower than the absolute optimum? Also, if you haven't already, please don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications to ensure you're receiving all of our content as soon as it's released. And make sure to check out all the resources we've discussed today, as well as the many more that are all available on BitcoinMagazinePro.com, your number one source for Bitcoin analysis. So just to summarize, knowing when to take profit on your Bitcoin positions is arguably even more important than knowing when to start scaling into your positions. Of course, scaling into your positions takes a lot of skill, but it's almost, I would say, harder to scale out of your positions when you actually have the coins, knowing you're ready to sell, rather than not having the coins you're waiting to buy, if that makes sense. And you need to be realistic with your profit taking. And no, you're not going to sell the entire stack at the exact top. Almost no one does this. Anyone that claims they do this repeatedly throughout multiple cycles is almost certainly just trying to sell you something, probably. And selling at a fixed price, like many people potentially did in the previous cycle, I'm going to sell at $100,000. If that price doesn't come, then you're going to be left with many other investors who just have to bag hold all the way through the bear cycle, watching all of those unrealized gains just vanish. And a systematic, emotionless approach for scaling out of your positions, like we've discussed many possibilities of that today, is so much less stressful and almost always performs considerably better. So plan your exit strategy for your Bitcoin positions now. If you will be selling any of your Bitcoin at all, if you're a long-term, lifelong holder, then to be honest, most of the content here was maybe a little redundant. But if, like me, you're trying to maximize the profit so you can scale back into Bitcoin with even more capital, then start planning now before euphoria, before these emotions, before everything starts kicking into gear. It becomes considerably less easy to even think about parting ways with your coins. If you liked this video, then please visit BitcoinMagazinePro.com, where our analytics help you to cut through the noise to make informed, data-driven decisions about Bitcoin. With over 150 live charts, personalized indicator alerts, in-depth crypto industry reports, API access, and a whole lot more, including the TradingView indicators we discussed today, all for a fraction of the standard industry price. And to celebrate the launch of Bitcoin Magazine Pro, we're currently offering a free trial for all new site subscribers. So don't miss out on this limited time opportunity to try out all of our advanced features today, absolutely free of charge. And let me know what your thoughts are on scaling out of your Bitcoin positions throughout this bull cycle. Will you be taking profits, scaling out similarly to how I will be doing it? Or are you confident that you'll be able to pile out everything in one lump sum at the absolute peak? As I said, let me know in the comments below and on social media. I look forward to reading and replying to all of them. Thank you all very much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.